Perfect. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to do my normal little short intro just to kind of give everybody an idea of what Palm Beach Tech is and what we do. To start with, my name is Nikki Caboose. I'm the VP of Development here at Palm Beach Tech. We recently just announced some expansion efforts for us to move into becoming a regional South Florida organization. And to give you an idea of what we do is we're basically a tech nonprofit, started in downtown West Palm, kind of built out into a Palm Beach County organization, like I said, now expanding. But what we do is our whole goal and mission is to build South Florida into a tech hub. So we work with our colleges, universities, coding schools, our headquartered local companies, a lot of the tech talent that's here, everything from what we're doing this morning, some technical workshops to give people some introduction into new skills or even upskilling. Also different panel discussions, resources, and really just trying to educate people that are here, connect our tech community, and also attracting new people. So attracting talent and businesses to the area. So of course I'll drop, my information, our website and chat as we go this morning, if anybody's got any questions or anything. But I did want to introduce Juan and Lindsay. Lindsay, if you wanted to give us a little intro on who you are, what you guys do, and then I figured you can hand it off and we can get right into the workshop.
Yeah, sounds perfect. My name is Lindsay. I'm the marketing manager for online courses at Flatiron School. For anyone not familiar, Flatiron School is a tech education boot camp. We train our students to learn the skills in coding, data science, and cybersecurity to change their careers or level up their tech career. And so today, excited to offer everyone here an Intro to Ruby workshop. Juan was actually one of our students and has now since helped us start teaching students how to gain the skills that they need to switch their careers into a career in tech. So I'll hand it off to him for what you guys are all here for. But if you have any questions about Flatiron School, feel free to Slack me on the Palm Beach Tech Slack or chat me privately, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Hi. My name is Juan Elias. I am a cohort lead here at Flatiron School. Basically, I'm just an instructor. Back in 2018, I graduated Flatiron myself after taking the immersive program in New York, which is like 3 months of just like a boot camp. It was a fun experience. I came in with like zero knowledge. I had no idea what code was, knew nothing about it. Didn't know what a div was, didn't know what HTML was. And I graduated building my own karaoke app just from scratch. It was an amazing experience for me. But a little bit about my background, like back. Before I got into coding, I was a philosophy graduate. I had a 4-year degree in philosophy. It was pretty interesting. I always loved problem solving. I always loved the intricacies of it, but I was always told I was never going to do anything with that degree, so I was always questioned about it. Then I started moving on into like pharmacy, and it just didn't fit anymore because it started becoming more of a business than helping people. So for me, the way I got into coding was I have a friend who builds games for a living. He built a game called Killer Queen. And one day I was in one of his showcases and I was just so intrigued on how it all went about. So he started showing me the source code. And the source code is just basically how the game is built behind the scenes. And immediately I fell in love. Immediately I was just like, okay, how does this work? How does this work? I need to know right now. And he would explain to me and I had no idea what was going on. So I wanted to go more into it. So I looked up some stuff here and there, but it just wasn't enough. And then I eventually found Flatiron School. And like I mentioned before, I knew nothing about coding before I got into Flatiron School. And Flatiron School has that curriculum where it builds you from the ground up. So it doesn't matter if you've been studying code for 2 years or you've just fresh off the boat, they treat you all the same. And it builds you up from the ground up to make sure you understand all the fundamentals of it. And it was just an amazing experience. But for today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give kind of like a small Ruby intro to Ruby workshop. It's just going to show you the basics of Ruby. I'm not going to go too deep into it because there's a lot of things that Ruby has, and an hour just isn't enough to go into like nearly half of what Ruby does. But I'm hoping that whatever I can show you today will give you some kind of interest in how coding works and make you understand that the powers of what programming is. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. So hope you all can see it. So for today, I'm going to use this website called Replit. There's a couple ways you can start programming, right? There's something called VS Code, which is a code editor. And that's where when you're a seasoned programmer, you're going to start using VS Code a lot more because you can start using that in your own computer. This Replit here is a text editor for the browser itself. So you can just go onto this website and it creates this text editor for you, and then you can start writing code just from scratch easily. So I'm going to scroll down to start coding, and there's many different programs. There's so many different languages you can choose from here, but for right now, we're going to start doing Ruby. And I'm going to create a REPL. Cool. So it's going to come out with this blank piece of slate here. And there's many things you can do with this. But for the beginning, I think I want to just show you the fundamentals of coding, like strings, variables, kind of like define what they are, kind of like what they do and how they work in Ruby. So start off, we're going to go with strings. So I'm going to write down the things we're going to work on. Strings, variables. Okay, I wish I could spell today. Methods. Maybe calculate arguments and calculations. Just because. Possibly return statements, but we'll see. All these things have their own purposes for Ruby, but the thing is, they're not only for Ruby. All of these are the fundamentals for any programming language. Every programming language has a string. Every programming language has a variable, methods, arguments, calculations. So here at Flatiron, we don't only teach you just Ruby. We're teaching you just the straight fundamentals of everything, right? This is a fun thing. This is a fun part. So I'm going to start off with things we can do with Ruby, right? With just programming in general. So in programming, you can write just about any statement and just click this run button and it'll run. So let's say we do 2 plus 2, right? Easy enough, like a calculator, right? If you write and run, we get the return statement of 4. Because how code works is that it reads from top to bottom. So it'll read this line, and Ruby is smart enough to say, okay, this is 2, and we're doing a calculation plus 2. So it's going to add it up straight. So that's the calculation part. So you can do anything really with it. You can do like 8 times 4. Or you can do 32 times 42. Right? Any kind of arithmetic calculation, programming is fully allowed to do for you. There's other things you can do, and there's a keyword here called puts that allows us to print things onto the screen. So with programming, the computer usually is talking to itself. So if you write a statement like hello world, or hey, or hello world, right? The computer's going to look at this, and the program's going to look at this as like, okay, you're telling me somewhere in my database I have, or somewhere in my program, I have a keyword called hello world, and I have to look for it, right? So when I run here, I'm going to get an error, and you'll see errors like this a lot. And it'll say like undefined local variable or method world for a main object. What this is basically telling you is it's looking for something called hello world inside our program somewhere, and it can't find it. So it's going to come out red and scream at us and yell at us and say, no, we can't do this. We can't use this. There's just no way. So what we're going to do instead is tell it that this is just plain English, and not code. And the way we do that is doing this put statement. This put statement allows us to print things out onto the screen. And we're going to throw them in quotations. And what these quotations do for us is that it tells Ruby that this statement that's inside of this particular, inside of these quotation marks is going to be English, just straight English, and should be interpreted as English, not code. So I can say hello world here. And I get out and I get a return value of hello world. Easy enough. So basically, again, that's what strings are. Strings is the way that we tell Ruby that the thing inside of here is not code. Not code at all. Cool. So that's strings, that's calculations. We're gonna get into methods in just a bit. I think I can get into methods and deal with variables at the same time. So I'm gonna do that. Cool. So I'm gonna create a method here. And what a method is, in programming, we create different methods. And think of them like machines, kind of, where they do something very, very specific for that program, right? So we create various methods because we have various machines that do different things for us all the time. So the way you start off a method and the way you write off a method would be you start off with something called def. And what def is just saying define. You're defining something. So you're defining, and you can name this whatever you want. This is your program. This is your choice. You can name this whatever you want. I can name this whatever lowercase, want, right? And the program will read it because you're creating this from scratch. This is not something that's already built into Ruby. This is something you're creating for yourself. And then you're going to define what this particular method or this particular machine is going to do. Cool. So this machine, let's say I want to use this machine real quick, right? And I want to say whatever I want is going to put out hello world. So def whatever I want. I wanted to put out hello world here. Now, how am I going to do that? So the same way before, we were just able to do puts hello world. This should work the same exact way theoretically, right? But here's the thing. Oops. If I run here, right? All I get back is whatever I want. I never get back this hello world here. And the reason particularly for that is because, like I mentioned before, this is like a machine, right? And you can have various machines that do different things, right? Puts something else, right? You can have various machines that do different things here, and hello world here, but they're still not running, right? All I'm getting returned back are these methods, the method names. But I want to run the machine. I want to use this machine because I need to use it. There's things inside of here that I need to get done. So how do you use these machines? That's the question. Each one of these machines has an on and off switch, right? The way you turn on this machine, it's quite simply calling its name. If you call the name of the machine, it'll turn it on. So what I mean by that, if I copy this name right here, whatever I want, and I put it at the end of this code right here, and I say whatever I want goes here. If I run here, it turns on the machine. It turns on this specific machine and uses the code that's inside of there. And whatever code I put in there, it's just going to throw it back out at me. So it works out. So, and then again, same thing with this one, right? Like, let's say I don't want to use whatever I want, right? Let's say I want to turn this off. I don't want to use this machine. I want to use various machines here, right? and I want to print out something else instead. Again, the way I would call it is, the way I would turn it on is just quite literally writing its name and saying, hey, I'm calling upon this particular machine. I need you to do what you need to do. So when I run here, I get back something else, which is the value that's inside of here. Now, alternatively, a cool thing you can do, and a thing that a lot of programmers do, is if you have two different machines, you can call this machine and then call this machine at the same time. Now, how do I do that? Let's say I want to use whatever I want here, and then I want to use various machines right after that. There's two ways you can go about that. I can literally do whatever I want, and then in the next line, I do various machines. And if I run, I get hello world and something else. Right? Good question. This nil. So remember before where I said that hello world here in the string is the way we talk to each other, is English, basically, not code. This nil is the code that the computer is talking to each other. So nil means nothing. It quite literally says it means nothing. And the reason why it says nil here is because each method has something called a return value. So each machine is supposed to return something that the program can use. Full on. If puts never technically returns anything, all it does is it prints out something to the screen for us to read, but it doesn't do anything for the program itself. Like Ruby cannot use this code right here. This code is solely for us to read as humans, not for anybody else. That's why, and then so when it reads this, it says, okay, I have nothing I can do with this. So there is a nil return value because there's nothing I can, Ruby says I can't do anything with this return at all. Make sense? Cool. So again, I can use these two here and I'll get hello and something else. Hello world and something else. So now I could delete these two here. And I said, I want to use less lines of code. Inside of this machine, I can call upon a different machine. So I can call upon this machine inside of this machine. So I can say various machines here. And at the bottom here, I can call whatever I want. So how Ruby works, right? Ruby will read from top to bottom, but it'll ignore these machines. These machines are just stored somewhere, right? So when it's reading from top to bottom, it's going to just completely ignore the order of this. It just doesn't care. It's there. It'll reach this line here, whatever I want, and say, okay, is there a method or is there a variable called whatever I want in like stored somewhere? Has that been defined at any point? So it'll look back and it say, oh, I saw whatever I want. Now I can execute and I can run this particular machine here. So then from there, it'll read from top to bottom again. So it's going to go, okay, I'm going to print out hello world. And then it's going to read this line and say, oh, there's another machine here. Let's go and look for that machine again. And it's going to call this machine here, various machines. And then it's going to do, okay, there's another machine called various machine. Let's turn that one on as well and call that. So the same thing you would get here from doing various machines, whatever I want in various machines, it does the exact same thing because it's going to run whatever I want and then it's going to run various machines here. So if I delete this, right, run, I get the same outcome. And a lot of programmers do this, right? to minimize the amount of code we want and minimize the amount of times we write the name of the method or try to turn it on, we chain methods. So we use this method and then we're going to want to use this method right after that. And that's how you would go about that. Cool. So I'm going to go into the variables and calculations before I run out of too much time here. Variables. What variables are, think of them like placeholders. Think of them like it's something that's going to hold some kind of value. So I can name a variable anything I want. The variable is you're creating on your own. You're creating this from scratch. So I can say something here. And I'm saying something is equal to hello world. Right? So I'm creating this variable called something. And I'm saying this something variable is equal to hello world. You can think of variables kind of like slang, right? You're creating a slang, and this slang is only visible for this particular like state or machine, right? Like for instance, I'm from New York, right? And in New York, we have this phrase called brick, right? And in New York, brick has the same meaning as it's cold, right? That's a variable. A variable is just like slang. It's just another way of writing this statement, another way of saying these words here. So another way of saying hello world would be saying something here. Another way of saying cold would be saying brick. And variables aren't only limited to just strings, right? You can do like number is equal to 42. Variables can take in any value and store it within it and say, okay, here, this is a variable. This is going to have some kind of value. As long as you have this equal sign here, you're giving this variable some kind of definition. If you just write like number like this, you're going to get an error because Ruby's going to read from top to bottom. It's going to get to this line here and say, I have no idea what number is. You've never defined it anywhere, right? So you have to give number some kind of value. And the way you give it a value is with this equal sign here. That makes sense? Cool. So now you have something, now you have brick, now you have number 42. We have three different kinds of variables here that we can use. They have all different kinds of values. So now watch this. Let's say I take out this hello world in a string now, right? Now what I can do is use these variables in some form or fashion. So I can say puts something here. Normally, right, with a put statement, you would put in quotation marks, right? The reason why you don't want to put quotation marks here, is because I don't want to print out the word something. I want to print out the value of what something is. And something, the value of something is hello world. So right now, if I type in whatever I want and I run, I get something, right? When naturally I want to get hello world because that's what this something's value is. So if I take out these quotation marks now, right? Ruby will read this as, oh, this is code. You've defined something at some point in time before this. So I can look inside my memory and say, where did you define something or where did you give something a value, right? So remember, quotations is English. No quotation is straight code. So now Ruby would come to line 12 and say, oh, put something. So it's going to come back here. At some point, we define something, and something is equal to hello world here. So when I run, I get the value hello world. And that's how variables work. That's 100% how variables work. It's just giving a value to something, to whatever you want to call it, and you can use it later on in your code or later on in your life, right? So I can say puts brick, and I'm going to get cold. I can put puts number, and I'm going to get 42. As long as you've defined these variables beforehand, you can use it at any time. Good. So we went over strings, variables, calculations, methods. Now it's up to arguments. Okay. This is the last part. It's a little confusing, but it's kind of like what variables do. So, arguments. Arguments has to deal with here. So every machine, sometimes machines need certain specifications before you start using them. Oops. Puts is like print, exactly. Print is for Python, but you can also use print here, and it'll still use it. The difference between prints and puts in Ruby is that puts will do it line every line, like it'll have a break between lines. Print will just do everything in one line, full on. But yes, we normally use puts because we want to break it down. We want to show it off like this, like the way this is showing off like this. But if we use print, it would show hello world and then something else. Yep. Cool. So arguments. You can think of like every machine might need some like prerequisites before you can turn it on, right? And these are what arguments are. These are the prerequisites before you turn it on. Like a coffee machine, you might need like actual coffee before to start brewing, right? You can't just turn it on and just hope magically you have coffee without any beans in there or whatnot, right? Same logic, right? This machine, you're telling it when you're creating it, it's going to take in a number as an argument. So you're saying, before I start using this machine, at some point, I need to give it a number. If I do not give this a number, this machine will not work. So, as you can see here, I have whatever I want, right? Same thing before. The only difference is now is that I created this argument number as a prerequisite. So if I just run now, I get an error saying wrong number of arguments, given 0, expected 1. Because I'm expecting this machine is expecting some kind of like prerequisite, is expecting some kind of number. Meanwhile, whatever I want, you're giving it nothing. It's had 0. There's nothing in there. So you have to finish filling out the prerequisites before you can turn on this machine. That's what arguments are. So I'm going to say, I'm just going to give it a random number, 27 here, right? And I'm going to just change this to num real quick. So now, if I run, I'm printing out number 42, right? I'm still doing the same thing, but now I've filled the prerequisites. This particular method now works. I can turn it on because I gave it a number. So why are arguments important? They're important because if you want to pass down information from method to method, you can pass information with arguments. So this num right here, right, is just a variable. This num is a variable that has a value of 27. So if I print out or I put out num here, and I run, I get 27 because it's using this variable num and saying, oh, what's the value of num? Oh, the value of num is 27. So that's how that works there. Now there's things you can do with this, right? So let's say I wanted this method to solely take whatever number I have and multiply it by num. This is what this method does. So I'm going to say add. So I can say number, right? Number is a variable that represented by, that has a value of 42 plus num. Now what this is doing here is that it's saying, oh, number, what's the value of number? 42. What's the value of num? 27. Okay, so I'm going to add 42 plus 27. 69. And notice how this is green and not white anymore. The put statement here is is showing us as humans that this is what's going to be read because it's in a string. When it's in green, this is showing the program itself what it is. So this is the return value of this method. So whenever I call this method, that the value of this method now is 69. So now I've officially created a program that will add two numbers for me together. So I can say whatever I want, 40 now, right? And I get 82. Whatever I want, 100. And I'll get 142. So I've officially created a method or a machine that will do math for me or a calculator for me, right? That does addition for me. So I can say, I can also create another method like def add two numbers, right? And it takes in multiple arguments. I'm going to say num1 and num2. And I can say num1 plus num2. That's all this method's going to do. It's just going to add two numbers together. So I can say, I don't know, add two numbers, and I can give it any two numbers I want now. I can say 84, comma 63. So now num1's value is going to be the first one, which is 84, and num2's value is going to be 63. So you're going to add these two together. 147. So I've officially created a program or a calculator in that sense that adds two numbers together whenever I want. And you can do that with multiplication, you can do division, and that's just the start, right? You can do so much, you can create so much with methods and arguments and things like that. And it's just the start of it. But yeah, that's about all I have for the intro part. Like I said, there's a lot to Ruby, there's a lot to programming, but these are like the basic fundamentals how to start like creating your own little like project, right? You start using methods and you start doing little things here and there, and you can start adding on to it. And again, these things right here, these strings, variables, methods, arguments, calculations, don't only sit for Ruby, they sit for every programming language. Every programming language has these concepts. And they use these concepts more. May use Ruby over another programming language, pros and cons. Okay, so there's different kinds of programming languages. There's back-end languages, there's front-end languages, there's data science. You would use Ruby mostly if you want to work more towards focus more towards the back-end aspect. Ruby focuses a lot on organization and something called object-oriented. What kind of apps use Ruby? Especially the calculation aspect of it. Okay, I'll go into the second one right after. So Ruby has a hard time creating like dynamic websites. Like websites that hold a lot of like when you click on things and do something else with it, or like drawing or games, right? They have a hard time doing like websites that do that, but they have Ruby has a strong functionality with holding information and processing information in towards the backend. So let's say I put in a login information, right? It can go through Ruby and Ruby will store it and do some calculations for you or do some processes for you. So you would mostly use Ruby for backend purposes, although Ruby does have front-end languages, front-end frameworks that help it create websites as well. Similarly, Twitter was built on Ruby. Well, technically Ruby on Rails, which is a framework with Ruby. But Twitter itself was built solely on Ruby on Rails and uses Ruby on Rails. Ruby, it's hard to say because JavaScript is a front-end language while Ruby is a back-end language. And when I say front-end language, JavaScript mostly deals with the browser and the website itself. So how to create and make functionalities within the browser, that's a front-end language, which JavaScript mostly holds. Ruby deals more with the internal things, the back-end things, the database, holding the information that comes from the front end to the back end. So like whenever I sign in, right? When I sign into Facebook, when I sign into Twitter, that information has to go to the back end first to verify that, yes, this is the actual person. This is the actual like person we're dealing with. And Ruby does that calculation for you, and Ruby does that that logic for you. So a lot of the logic aspect of code comes from the back end. The front end has a lot to do with how to make things work in the browser, how to make the logic work in the browser. Make sure these click, make sure I'm able to click this perfectly, make sure everything works there. And yeah. So are they similar? They do similar things, but they hold their purposes are different. You can still make websites with Ruby. You can still do backend logic and databases with JavaScript. They have the same potential, but one's is stronger in one aspect than the other. And front end, JavaScript is much more powerful than Ruby is. And for backend, Ruby would be more powerful at that aspect because that's how they were just built. Can you insert SQL statements? Yes, but remember, SQL is its own language, right? It's not technically Ruby. You can insert SQL within different languages as well, right? You can go into Ruby and insert a SQL statement. You can go into JavaScript, Python, and insert a SQL statement. SQL is its own language. SQL is something very, very separate that has its own thing that deals with databases. Does that make sense? So right here, I wouldn't be able to do SQL statement because I'm doing a Ruby file, a simply Ruby file. I haven't downloaded SQL onto my REPL right here to be able to use it. Also, I'm not using a database to be able to use SQL here. Yeah. Personally, I love Ruby. You want me to call a SQL script right now? Okay. But generally you can, yes. Yeah, you can. You definitely can. And you definitely do a lot of times because when you're creating your database, right, with Ruby, you would have to incorporate SQL with it. And you can use SQL code inside of Ruby code as well. There's something called ORM, right, which is object related mapping that allows us to do that. This one right here, REPL, is for browser. That's for everybody. It's for free. The Visual Studio Code, which I usually use, which is great for JavaScript, is free. And anybody can download it. And this is what I mostly use. But yeah, I honestly, when I started Flatiron, I really fell in love with Ruby because of how simple it is. Ruby caters a lot to beginners. Ruby caters a lot to, it makes things easier for people who just want to learn, because a lot of it is just plain English. And you can read code, and like a lot, like if you look at this, right? There's nothing really too scary about this. A lot of it is just English, right? Def, which is define. And then none of this really looks like real code, right? It just looks like, hey, you're doing math here. Hey, you're doing a comma here, separating two different things. Hey, you're setting this equal to something. There's nothing too abstract about it, nothing too crazy. And that's what I really loved about Ruby. Like, it caters a lot to beginners, and it helps you understand the fundamentals for learning programming in general, because you get so accustomed to it. And when you get to harder languages, right? Like JavaScript is not the easiest and friendliest language to learn. Yeah, Ruby isn't the JavaScript isn't the friendliest language to learn, because there's a lot of like, the way you have to write certain things is kind of difficult. But once you get the hang of it, and once you understand the foundations, things get easier. What are some of the other languages that Ruby works best with? Ruby and JavaScript works really, really well together. You can use Ruby. I haven't personally used Ruby with anything else. I either use Ruby straight by itself, because it has the power to create websites all on its own, or it has the power to just do the backend languages. But the reason you mostly use it with JavaScript, because JavaScript is mostly just a front end language, so it just meshes. So there's not just that many solely front end languages like that it can work with. But if you do find a front end language, Ruby can still work with front end language, because you can just create a database with Ruby and then have all the logic go from Ruby to that front end language. But mostly it's just with JavaScript, if anything. And if it's not with JavaScript, you're mostly just doing it by yourself. Mostly just using Ruby by itself and creating websites with Ruby. And the same goes with JavaScript, right? JavaScript, JavaScript can work with PHP because it's another backend language. JavaScript can work with Python, another backend language. JavaScript can work by itself with just JavaScript, right? Yeah, Node.js is JavaScript. Yep. But Ruby is more of just a straight backend language that very, very, very similar to Python. Like, this syntactically, they're so similar to Python. Like, it would literally work the same way, just like this, without writing the end. It would work like this. That's Python. But Ruby, you just have to write an end to end the method. But yeah, Ruby is more, I feel, is very beginner friendly. They're they're very, very similar to each other. Like, it's almost hard. Like, if you know Ruby, you're gonna pick up Python so easily, because they literally look almost the exact same way. Like I said, Ruby is very, very beginner friendly. I highly recommend learning Ruby first if you want to like really learn programming, because of how simple it is. Ruby and Python are great to pick up first because they're just English. Yes, there are so many languages to learn, but here's the thing, right? There's a bunch of languages to learn, but if today you asked me to learn a language, if today you told me go learn Golang or go learn C#, I can tell you confidently, I can learn that in about a week. Not because it's easy, but because I know the fundamentals of programming. And the fundamentals of programming go onward for every language. They never change. They have strings, they have variables, they have methods, they have arguments. You just have to learn how to write it. It's like me going and learning German, right? I just have to learn how to write the German, but I know what words are still, right? Ruby has been easier for me than even HTML and CSS because it's practically English. Yep. Do you have a couple of examples that show the end results? I know you mentioned Twitter. Right off the top of my head, I know Twitter was just straight based on was fully, I think they changed it now, the framework, but like when it first started, it was all on Ruby on Rails for sure, 100%. Not sure of anything else off the top of my head that's built off Ruby on Rails. There's a couple. I just don't remember off the top of my head. Yeah, Ruby's really fun, my opinion. I don't regret ever learning Ruby first because now I can confidently say I can go into any programming language and just say I can learn this in about a week because I know how things work. I know how to go from A to Z. I just need to learn how to write it. HTML's fun. HTML's fun. I like HTML. Different way of writing it. So like if I inspect here, this is HTML. All this is HTML. But the thing about HTML, it can get really, really scary, right? Like look at all this. Like all this can get really, really scary, and looking at it like, what the heck am I doing here? And what am I supposed to do here, right? There's a lot of information here, and if you're like comfortable with HTML yet, it can get really, really overwhelming really quick, right? That's why I don't like HTML as much, because it can get really scary. But you can still break things down, like using this inspect button here. You can break things down, take things you really, really want, and use them.
Very good. I'm watching the time. We've only got a few minutes left. Thank you everybody that's been dropping all the comments and questions in chat, and Juan for being really good about looking at all those. You're right on top of it. Does anybody have any other questions or comments or anything that you're hoping that Juan might be able to show us now that he's got the screen pulled up? Does anybody have anything else? Yes, thank you too, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think so far I'm looking on social too. I don't think we've got any other comments or questions, so I think we're good. Did you or Lindsay want to drop either your email or some sort of link or something into the chat for anybody that's watching today? I did drop your website link in there.
Yeah, that's perfect. I'll drop our free coding bootcamp prep course in there too, if people want to take a look.
Okay. Yeah, that would be great. And of course, we're going to be having some more workshops, coming up, and we hold them, all of the technical workshops, every Friday at 10 a.m. So please, check our calendar on the Palm Beach Tech website for future events. And of course, we'll do some more with Flatiron as well. So if anybody has even any suggestions or anything that they would like to do, please let us know. Cool. Thank you so much, Lindsay, for dropping that in there. So for anybody that can't see it or is watching on social, it's flatironschool.com/free-courses/coding-bootcamp-prep. So I will put that on social in the comments as well for people. But thank you very much for that, Lindsay. And I think we're good. So just wanted to thank everybody for coming again. Juan for being here to give us be the instructor for our intro course this morning. And thanks again, everybody.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Have a great day, guys.
Bye.